afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Conference of State Legislatures for this webinar on fiscal notes. My name is Erica Michael, and I'm a member of the Fiscal Affairs Program at NCSL, and I'll be the moderator of today's webinar, Understanding Fiscal Notes. Today's webinar is sponsored by the National Association of Legislative Fiscal Offices, known as NALFO. NALFO is one of the 10 staff sections associated with NCSL. NALFO's mission is to improve the quality and effectiveness of legislative fiscal staff and the services they provide to state legislatures. For more information on NALFO or NCSL's other activities and services, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. The purpose of this webinar is to examine fiscal notes that are prepared and reviewed by legislative fiscal staff. The webinar will explore challenges and opportunities of fiscal notes and answer important questions about what fiscal notes contribute to a bill. Our discussion will feature presentations from two legislative fiscal directors whose offices regularly prepare fiscal notes. After we hear from our panelists, we will open up the discussion to include questions from the audience. To ask questions, you can simply type a question in the Q&A box in the right-hand side of your corner of your screen at any time. Your question will not be visible to everyone, only to the webinar administrators. We'll take as many questions as possible with the time we have available. Our first presenter will be Alan Calandro, who's been the director of Connecticut's Office of Fiscal Analysis for 4 years, and he's been working with the office for 20 years. He also has experience with the Department of Social Services and as a private sector manager. He serves as an advisory board member for the New England Public Policy Center at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and is the Vice President of the National Association of Legislative Fiscal Offices. Our second presenter, Lucien Geist, was appointed the Executive Director of the Tennessee Fiscal Review Committee in 2011. Previously, Lucien served as the Senior Legislative Attorney in the Tennessee General Assembly's Office of Legal Services. Lucien began his public service career in the Tennessee Attorney General's Office as an Assistant Attorney General. Before we hear from our panelists, let's review some quick facts about fiscal notes across the United States. In 2012, NCSL surveyed legislative fiscal offices in the 50 states. 52 legislative fiscal offices in 43 states responded to the survey. 30 of the 52 offices that responded prepare fiscal notes, and many others review fiscal notes. The process of preparing fiscal notes, however, varies greatly from state to state and from office to office. The average number of fiscal notes prepared each year ranges from as few as 10 to as many as 9,000, and some offices prepare more fiscal notes that are never officially released. The legislation that requires a fiscal note also varies by state and office. For 20 offices, all introduced bills require a fiscal note attachment, and 15 offices prepare fiscal notes at the request of a legislator. 20 offices review fiscal notes prepared by the executive branch, and a handful of offices prepare consensus fiscal notes with the executive branch. Now that we've had a brief overview of fiscal notes in the states, I'll turn the program over to Alan Calandro, who will provide insight into the fiscal note process in Connecticut. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you very much, Erica. It's my pleasure to be here today. My name is Alan Calandro, and in terms of preparing a presentation for you all, we tried to hit some major points. I know in the case of my presentation, I know Lucian's also, we're trying to show you some of the key points of how our states work and point out some other issues. So let's, in terms of what we're going to cover today, just in terms of my presentation, we're going about 20 minutes each. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about OFA and our duties, the number of fiscal notes we do, and the time frames in which we have to produce them, the changing expectations within the legislature, what fiscal notes can and can't tell you, what they should and shouldn't be used for, and I'll look at some of the tools that we use to actually prepare the fiscal notes. And the last piece would be the issues and challenges about fiscal notes, which is probably the most interesting part of this. So briefly about OFA, we were created in '72, which I think is a common theme across the country. We're a central nonpartisan staff office, so we are working for both the House and the Senate and the Republicans and Democrats. We have 27 full-time staff, 17 analysts. We have 2 budget system people and IT-related people actually in our office. We also have some IT support outside the office. 5 analyst managers, including myself, and 3 administrative support people. This is interesting. I'm not exactly sure how analysts are assigned across the various other states, but in our case, we are assigned by the state agency or revenue area of the budget and revenue side. In the case of other parts of our nonpartisan offices, most nonpartisans are assigned by committee, whereas we're assigned primarily to appropriations and finance, and support the other committees, but mostly work with appropriations and finance and divvy up our duties according to our agencies and topic areas. So we do serve legislative leadership first, appropriations and finance, all the committees essentially, although just not as much or as often as appropriations and finance, and of course rank and file legislators. And in our case, the leadership is appointed by the joint leadership of the General Assembly. Just briefly, there's a lot of different duties that OFA does. I was just trying to show you a list of the range of duties that we have, and I think they're going to be similar to a lot of what other fiscal offices do. So we track the budget, we track the revenue side, we are tracking pretty much all of the revenue and expenditure streams in the state. So that includes the appropriation side, tax expenditures, the revenue side, the capital budget, and non-appropriated funds. We publish a state document. We help the appropriations and finance committees come up with alternative ideas. We have to calculate the spending cap. We also have a couple of other areas that are not directly related to us, but we operate the Transparency CT website, which is a site that shows government spending in Connecticut. And we also are assigned the task of helping facilitate results-based accountability in Connecticut, and also the Results First initiative. And of course, for what we're here talking about today, we also do fiscal notes. So, what do we do fiscal notes on? We prepare fiscal notes on all bills considered in the Appropriations and Finance Committees, and that means anything that makes it to any kind of public hearing stage, we have to prepare at least brief fiscal notes for those. On top of that, any bills that are reported out of any committee have to have a fiscal note before they go to the floor. All amendments to any of those bills that make it to the floor have to also have fiscal notes. A piece of legislation cannot be considered. It technically can be passed, and there have been cases where legislation has passed without a fiscal note, but it may not be taken up without a fiscal note, and is not supposed to be passed without a fiscal note, but usually that's based on whether somebody raises an objection, and that's very rare that happens. Not the objection, the passage without the note. We also prepare fiscal notes on special acts, resolutions, collective bargaining agreements, and also regulations. So when adding everything up, the total of all those items is about 3,000, depending on the session, which works out to be about 176 per analyst. We have a 2-level review for every fiscal note. The first level is a peer-level review, which involves teams across the office, 2-person teams across the office that review each other's fiscal notes, and then any fiscal note is then reviewed by the supervisor of the primary preparer of the fiscal note. Time frames. I'm sure everyone experiences these short time frames. In the case of the Appropriations and Finance Committees, this could be a very short turnaround, 1 to 3 calendar days. It could be that we are screening a bill on one day, and the next meeting could be 2 days from then. Sometimes it's been the next day. So it's usually a very short period of time to prepare something, although if it's for screening bills, we probably have seen them prior to them getting to appropriations, so well, at least we've had some heads up. In the case of bills reported out of committee, those are scattered across all of our committees in Connecticut, which are joint committees. And we have 5 calendar days once the bill is formally drafted and arrives in OFA. The interesting thing about this is that because OFA is assigned according to topic area and not by committee, we try to have people who are related to some of the subject matter coming out of the committees attend those committee meetings, attend the screenings of bills in those committees, and be familiar with the bills. But in the case of some agencies, there are cross-cutting issues such as, say, if you are handling the judicial department, you could get a bill that comes out of the Public Safety Committee, you could get a bill that comes out of the Judiciary Committee, and you could also get a bill that comes out of the Human Services Committee or the Children's Committee. So trying to attend all of those committees and being fully knowledgeable about everything that's happening with those bills is a tough call. And that's one of the disconnects between the way our office is organized and the way the legislature is ultimately organized. So then the third piece is the amendments. Amendments are the largest portion of all the fiscal notes that we do. And in that case, those are pretty much at any time that we get an amendment, a fiscal note can be needed. A lot of times we will be asked for the fiscal note before we actually get the amendment. So typically, in general, most of the amendments come in, and we have some preparatory time beforehand, a day, 2 days, maybe a week. Obviously, if they're not in session, and we get it on a day when they're not in session, then we have time before that. Very often the amendments are filed during a session, and the need for them is immediate. And that's where it can get a little tense sometimes. And of course, time for the rest of these special acts, resolutions, collective bargaining agreements. There's a little bit of a difference between all of these, but essentially it's about 5 days to 1 to 2 weeks for the collective bargaining agreements. And regulations are probably the longest period of time, which is 2 weeks. So I just wanted to make a quick note before we got into some other things, which is just about how things are changing for fiscal offices. And it affects fiscal notes, but it affects everything else. And it's, if you go back 20 years, and in my case, you can probably hear it in my voice that I've been here for 20 years, the old expectation is pretty much, you needed people here to write down numbers, track the numbers, add up the numbers, make sure the numbers added up right, and perform a lot of processing type functions. Now, it is completely different. There's information everywhere. It's easy to add up numbers. There's spreadsheets. All of that processing stuff has been automated. It's a lot easier to do all that. The expectation now is, what does this stuff mean? And not only what does it mean, we need it now. We want our answer now. And that's the challenge we get, not just with fiscal notes, but with all of the requests that come into our office these days. And because of that, fiscal notes, it's just the way things are now. Things get more scrutiny, and there's more room for disagreement and other pieces of information that can come into play to possibly dispute a conclusion in a fiscal note. And I think there's an answer for this, which is more and bigger data systems, but that's it's a separate but a related topic. And if anybody has any questions about that, I can talk about that later. Okay, so I think every state's a little bit different here, and I know Tennessee is different. So in Connecticut, what do Connecticut fiscal notes tell you? They will tell you the fiscal impact to state government and to town government. They can tell you the programmatic impact when it's relevant, usually when it's relevant to help figure out what the fiscal impact is. We are mandated to tell the reader over how long the fiscal impact will occur. In our case, we're mandated for 5 years. We're also mandated to indicate whether the legislation is a state mandate on towns. By definition, since we're doing a fiscal note, we would also include federal funds impact. And, of course, we would also probably include anything that would be non-appropriated funds, tax expenditures, anything fiscally related across the state we would include in our impact. The impact that we have been focusing on so far in Connecticut has been generally direct impact only and has not been of the dynamic type. So our analysis tends to be based on all else being equal. So if we raise or lower a sales tax, we're not going out several steps about what could happen economically based upon raising or lowering the sales tax. And the same thing with a prevention program. In Connecticut, so in our state, our fiscal notes do not tell you what the racial or incarceration impact will be. We actually had a push for this a while back, and there was a compromise reached where a legislator could request it under a certain limit through judiciary. But basically, we had one or two of those, and we haven't gotten any since then. There's been a lot of talk about doing economic impacts, job impacts, private sector impact. We have prepared estimates on those as to what we would need to do those, and politically, it has not gone any farther than that. There's been a lot of talk about the last bullet, the extended assumptions dynamic impact, and primarily in our state, it hasn't been so much. Lately, it's been more on the tax side, but for a long time, it was much more on the prevention side. So that if there was frustration about the fact that if there was a program put in place that would prevent some type of health problem, for instance, that we didn't have something that showed what the savings would be down the road of reduced spending because of that prevention program. That has gone away somewhat, and now there's a little more emphasis on tax changes, but I wouldn't say we're in the middle of any push to go in the direction of dynamic impact. So a couple other things. What should fiscal notes, at least in Connecticut, be used for or not be used for? They are to get an estimate from a reliable, nonpartisan, trusted organization on what the legislation could do to the state's or town's budget or revenue levels. That's what we do right now, and sometimes that leads to confusion from readers. And the point of that is to provide another level of information to help legislators decide on policy. It is not directly linked to the budget. It should be considered an advisory piece of information, and sometimes there's confusion on that also. So, for instance, the fiscal note should not determine whether a legislator votes yes or no on a bill. Policymakers are not prohibited to vote yes or no based on whatever a fiscal note says. The fiscal note just has to be in front of them. It's one of the many factors that is involved in deciding policy. One of the misperceptions here, at least, is that a fiscal note is directly linked to the budget. If a bill, the assumption is, and especially this happens in appropriations, is if a bill passes through appropriations or through the General Assembly, there's an assumption that the fiscal note somehow automatically adjusts the budget, which is not, of course, the case. There are two different tracks. One track is the fiscal note track, which is basically coming out of our office and involved with the legislature, and of course the other part of it is what we put in the budget through appropriations. So, or on the revenue side through finance. The other assumption is that what is put out there in the fiscal note is somehow more infallible than it actually is. And again, what we try to tell people is that these should be used for estimates. They should not be used as some infallible document of a statement on cost that could never be changed. Of course, we're willing to change it if we have other information. This is just a quick note on what our production tools are. I'm sure every state that has fiscal notes has tools that they use. We have a task list in Connecticut that's an electronic list that gets populated with the bill when it gets assigned to our office. It does not contain amendment assignments yet. That's one of our hopes for the future. But the good thing about it is that not only does it assign the bill, but it tells you the due date, and it also has linkages to the various other pieces of information that we would use, such as if there is a draft in progress in the attorney's office, we will be able to click on it and see where it stands as of whatever time it's being prepared. And the same thing with the research summary. We have a sister office, the Legislative Research Office, that prepares a non-fiscal summary, and we're able to see that while that's being worked on. So we can see it during the time it's being worked on, and also when it's finalized. The main thing that we use is the Fiscal Note Wizard, which I'm going to show you in a slide or so. And that's how we automate the actual fiscal note. And then the last thing is the reviewer list, which allows us to go in and ensure that all fiscal notes are actually being reviewed, and it gives the individual the ability to sign off on particular fiscal notes. Data sources for fiscal notes. These are fairly not much of a surprise to anybody, I'm sure. State agencies are probably the most important area for getting information. We also get information from municipal governments. We have other nonpartisan staff in the building that are attending meetings and getting testimony, so we will talk to them and get insight into things. We will also obtain information from interest groups, obviously with caution, because we know that they have a point of view, and we try to rely on the logic of if there are objections to certain bills, what the logic of what they're pointing out is. But also, a lot of times there are associations of, say, plumbers, and if we're trying to raise a fee or lower a fee or institute a fee on, probably institute a fee in this case, for plumber apprentices that has never been done before, we'd want to go to an association that it might have an idea of how many of those there are. Obviously, any testimony presented during a hearing would be helpful. There are many external databases now that never used to be available before. The Internet is a huge source of information. And 7 would be the internal databases, and that, again, relates to what I was talking about before, where building information on hand is the way to go. And the introduction on the top of the slide is, I just wanted to point out the difference between fiscal notes that are agency-based program changes and formulaic type changes. So if you have an agency program change, the input of the agency is going to be extremely helpful. And that's a case where, okay, if you've done this many of these types of things before, how many staff have been working on this, and trying to get some benchmark to compare how much more staff would be needed, or what type of workload would be affected by instituting an expansion or new program. In the case of a formulaic or entitlement-driven program, all of those demographic factors could be involved, and the economic factors, numbers of people in certain groups. Those are things that can be found on the Internet or anywhere, and that's just a matter of finding the best information. Okay, so here's what we call the Fiscal Note Wizard. And just quickly to show you, we have the various fiscal note types that we can pick from. We enter the bill number here. It will populate the name of all the information related to the bill will populate automatically, whereas previously we used to have to type it all in. You select your primary analyst, your contributing analyst, and then select here whether there is a state impact or a municipal impact. And then once that opens up, you will be able to enter your information, which here's a completed wizard form. And I completely made up this bill. So this is an actual bill title that popped up. And I just made up these entries. But these are just, okay, state impact, yes. Oops, I didn't highlight my pointer. In this case, there is state impact, yes. And banking department, attorney general, there's a cost, there's a savings, you enter the amount. You could apply inflation if you wanted to, and the system would calculate the inflation based on a 3% or whatever amount we put in. And in this case, I said that it was a one-time cost and savings, so that I put none in the out years. And you can see that there are 5 years here. In the case of the municipalities, you can pick specific towns, you can pick a range of towns, and you have roughly the same range of fiscal impacts that you have for the state. And once you click Finish on the wizard, you will get something that looks like what you see on your screen. And the key thing is having boxes with numbers, and that is the challenge, to make sure that our fiscal notes, and when you're doing 176 per person, it's not so easy, is to have all your fiscal notes have actual numbers within each column and each box, and not have words such as minimal. So you do have the option. The goal is to try to get to, is basically to zero out the use of any kind of words and only have numbers or ranges, less thans, more thans, but basically have numbers, not have word descriptions. Just as if you were going to the store and buying a refrigerator and you asked them how much and they said, it's significant, that's the cost. Well, you kind of need to know how much it is before you buy it. So we're also mandated to produce something on the out years. And so at the end of every fiscal note, this is also produced in the wizard. 2 boxes are prepared the same way, and we just go back. In the explanation portion here, there's all the explanation that you would put in to support the estimates that are on top. I'm going to show you the actual fiscal note in a second, but so some technical stuff. When the fiscal note is completed, it is a couple things. There are the bills, the actual fiscal note on a bill, fiscal note on an amendment. If it's a bill, it's published in a hard copy file form, which also goes up on the web. And that happens pretty much, we have a deadline during that day, and that's within 5 days, and it will go on the web the next day. If it is an amendment, it will get posted on the web almost immediately once we're done with it. And copies are automatically sent to the printers in each caucus of each chamber, so that all caucuses have access to the fiscal note immediately when it's done. They can obviously refer to the website and also see it there, but this sends them notice right away that here's the fiscal note, and the clerks can make copies for everyone. If you're working on these, you can submit them off-site through the network. And quickly, I'm going to run through this because I'm talking too much. Quickly, here's just how here's how Senate Bill 1 actually looked in real life. If you wanted to find fiscal notes, if anyone was so inclined, they could go to our website or go to the CGA website and use these boxes up top. And there are a bunch of issues related to fiscal notes, which I don't want to cut into Lucian's time, so I'm just going to say there are various things that, as staff people, we all struggle with. And here's our website if you want to take a look at it. And here's my contact information. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Lucian and take it away.
Thank you, Alan. I am Lucian Geis. I'm going to give you how things work here in Tennessee. Good to be with everybody this afternoon. Get this straightened out. So what I plan to talk about first is introducing you to the Fiscal Review Committee here in Tennessee, explaining how the fiscal note process works here, and then highlight some drafting issues that our analysts face regularly. The Fiscal Review Committee in Tennessee, like in Connecticut, is a statutory creature. We were created in 1967. As I understand, one of the first efforts at the state level to have some independence of the administration. The committee itself is a creature of statute. We have a bipartisan and bicameral membership that is based upon it also reflects the makeup of the political parties in each house, so that each house has a designated, or each party has a designated number of the members of the committee. The functions of the Fiscal Review Committee are quite broad. Of course, I'm going to talk today about how we analyze fiscal impact of legislation, but we also review certain contracts that the administration has entered into that are sole source contracts. We have a team that provides revenue estimates for the State Funding Board, and we also serve at the pleasure of the committee, so we troubleshoot issues as they crop up that might affect the state's budget. In Tennessee, the Fiscal Review Committee staff drafts the fiscal notes. We are responsible for what they ultimately say. We get information from departments and agencies and any other source that we can, but we're the ultimate arbiter of what they say and what the bill actually costs. The staff is 13 members strong. We have fiscal analysts, attorneys, economists, an accountant, and a dedicated local government analyst. We serve at the pleasure of the Joint Committee. There is a chair and a vice chair, one of each house, and we have a separate legislative budget office. I know that in many states, the fiscal officers include both of those functions within one office. But we have the Office of Legislative Budget, and I understand several of them are on this webinar, and I ask they hold me accountable if I make a mistake on this thing. I also want to take the time to thank the Fiscal Review staff here in Tennessee. They're really the experts in how to draft a fiscal note, and they're really a good group of people who work together, pull together under some difficult times to make it through to put a fiscal note on each bill, and I just wanted to thank them in public. You know what a fiscal note is. I'll probably use various terms, and I wanted to just give you an idea. A fiscal note is what we issue for bills. We issue a fiscal memorandum for any amendment to those bills. We also may issue either a corrected fiscal note or a corrected memorandum after the first one has been issued if it is presented to us a good enough reason that we have made an erroneous assumption or miscalculated something in the original fiscal note. So we do issue corrections if we happen to make a mistake. We put fiscal notes on bills because we're directed to, first by statute, to provide fiscal notes on all general bills that increase or decrease state or local revenues, and also to comply with the Constitution's requirements. The Constitution requires that any bill that passes is null and void unless it is receives its first year's funding in the Appropriations Act. So unlike Connecticut, the fiscal note in Tennessee is tied directly to the budget, because the fiscal note, if it costs something, needs to get included in the budget or it becomes null and void. Additionally, the Constitution requires that the state share any mandatory expenditure that the state puts upon local government. So we keep track of what those local government expenditures are to make sure that that amount gets included in the budget as well. Numbers-wise, in the last 2 years, we have averaged about 2,500 documents combining fiscal notes and fiscal amendments, so 2,500 each year. So the process in Tennessee, this is an overview, and I'm going to talk about each of these steps in the next few slides. But basically, the bill is introduced. It is assigned to a department or agency. We receive a support form from an entity. A fiscal analyst reviews that support form and analyzes the impact and then drafts the fiscal note. We internally review it in our office, and then once it is in as good a shape as we can get it in, and free from any errors that we recognize, we approve it, and it is issued and sent out to be a part of the legislative package that legislators consider. The bill is introduced. Bills are filed in either house or sent electronically to us. I assign it to a fiscal analyst based upon the department that is most affected. We have a statutory deadline of 10 days to complete the fiscal note on each bill that has been filed. And as you can imagine, that's unworkable. So there is a general understanding that we complete the fiscal note at least by the first committee calendar that bill is on. Or if a member requests an earlier fiscal note, we will certainly try to accommodate as best we can. We actually filed a bill this year to try to put our practical timeline into statute so that we weren't violating the statute with every bill. And that was sailing along pretty well until it hit the House floor and got caught up in the Common Core debate. So that's still on the records, or still in the statute. The bills are filed immediately, are sent to us, but we must get the amendments actually delivered to us by the member's office. That's either by email or fax or in person. That is because of attorney-client privilege. The Office of Legal Services will draft the document for the amendment document for a member, and it's up to the member to share it with whom they care to share it with. So we have to affirmatively get any amendments, and we're usually trying to track those down and get to work as soon as we can on them. The bill is assigned to the fiscal analyst by departments. Each fiscal analyst manages between 6 and 10 departments, and once a bill is assigned to an analyst, they're responsible for completing the fiscal note and any subsequent memos for amendments. So basically, they own the bill. In addition, each fiscal analyst is a point of contact for any other analyst communication needs within their assigned departments. So you may not have the bill assigned to you, but one of your fellow fiscal analysts needs help. You email or send information and responses back and forth from that department and then communicate with your fellow fiscal analysts. We send the bill to a department and have worked with them over the years to try to get an information that we need to analyze the fiscal impact. And we have developed an official support form that we have generated, sent to them, and departments know what information we're looking for. And I wanted to walk you all through what that official support form is. As I came to this office, I just assumed a lot of other states use this, but Alan had asked me earlier for a copy of it, and I thought maybe other states would be interested. You're certainly welcome to take what you like. I included that in the materials that are available on this webinar. But first we asked to identify the bill by number, what kind of response this is, whether it's in a bill or an amendment, or even a corrected version of one of those. We also asked to identify the drafting number. Each document that is in the legislative consideration has an official drafting code that the Office of Legal Services puts on it, and that's how we identify what bill or amendment we're talking about. We also asked for contact information and a word description of how the bill impacts the department or program. We next look at different fiscal impacts, starting with the state fiscal impact. We ask whether it increases or decreases state expenditures, increases or decreases state revenue. We look by fiscal year and whether it is a one-time or a recurring cost, and finally by which particular fund might be affected by the legislation. After state impact, we look at that same information for the local government. So local fiscal impact by year, one-time versus recurring, and then for local impact, we also break it down into mandatory or permissive. Mandatory is the bill requires locals to do something. If it's permissive, the locals have the option to do it or not do it. And that's treated differently for constitutional and budgetary purposes. We next ask about federal implications. So here, federal implications, increasing or decreasing expenditures and or revenue by fiscal year, whether it's one-time or recurring, and again, the fund that's affected, the particular federal expenditures tied to which fund. We have follow-up questions asking for their methodology and for them to show us the data that they use to determine the department's fiscal analysis, as well as any assumptions that they use in their calculations. We ask if the funding is included in the governor's budget, because that gets special emphasis that I'll talk about in just a few minutes. Again, specifying which funding we're talking about. If there is funding in the governor's budget, we designate the administration bills in our fiscal note. We don't take the department's word that it's included in the budget, but we verify it with the administrative budget office and note if there's any differences in what we think it costs and the amount of funding that has been included in the budget. However, the administrative initiatives seem to get fast-tracked around here. The support form indicates the federal funds. If the department feels that the federal funding may get jeopardized, we ask for some specificity of why that is before we stick our neck on the line for that as well. Ask which particular reserve fund might be impacted, and if there's any cost avoidance that the department would be able to save money based upon the bill's outcome. Beginning this year, we were asked to also include fiscal notes a statement about any foreseeable impact to commerce on any general bill, which is referred to one of these three committees, one in the Senate and two in the House, which primarily handle business type bills. And I wanted to at least mention this. It's something that we are still developing a handle on how to do it, but we started with the same methodology for the usual fiscal analysis, developing a support form that asks a number of targeted questions about economic activity and job creation and other commercial impact, and ask departments to send us that when a bill has been referred to those committees. What we got back was a lot of answers that they weren't real sure how a bill might impact commerce, that wasn't in their bailiwick, and didn't feel comfortable giving us much data. So we then reached out to the business lobby and developed that same support form by putting it on our website and sought public input on any bill. So we put a template on our website, and anytime a member of the public or member of the industry wants to give us information on the commerce impact of a particular bill, they're able to do that, and it comes to us. This year we had very little response, and I would say it's still a work in progress. As this idea was floating, I talked to NCSL and some other departments or some other states about how they might manage this exercise, and I appreciate the support in it, but it's such unusual animal that we're kind of feeling our own way on it. And if anyone has any questions or comments, I'm happy to talk with you kind of after this as well. All of the support form information that we get from departments is treated as public records. So if there is something that might be confidential and departments have a concern about, we ask that they let us know on the front end and tell them to discourage any editorial comments. We use a paperless system for our drafting program, and it is called FileNet. It's an IBM product. There are some pluses and minuses about that. I really wish we had a fiscal note wizard. That sounds like a good idea. I'm going to hurry up through here some of this. This is our fiscal note template. We show first a summary of the bill, the estimated impact in bold, which is what the Finance Committee uses, and then an assumption based upon what we used for our methodology. I'll just highlight some of these issues, and if anyone would like more information or talk later, you're welcome to email me at my contact. We issue particular information for bills that lead to incarceration costs. We've developed a formula for trying to calculate what the expenditures would be for penalizing or for incarcerating criminals that we use on those. If there is a new fine amount, we try to capture that. We have, as I said, a local government analyst who's responsible for determining cost to local governments. And again, local governments get not only mandatory costs, but also permissive costs. And if it's a mandatory, it has to get built into the budget. We look at generally the long-term and immediate fiscal impacts. So we have a 2-year standard that we try to use in our bills, but we reflect the cost as fully as we can to explain what those immediate and long-range impacts are. Let's see. We have several health insurance mandates. I know that health analysts know much more about those, but I wanted to provide those opportunities of what we do. And lastly, talk about the cumulative fiscal note. At the end of each session, we total up what all the bills that have passed to become law, what they cost, and share that with legislators and cross-reference with the Appropriations Act to make sure that they are funded as well. Lastly, we have a public chapter review. Todd, I think my website has frozen, so you all may want to take control of this, but I'll share with you all the public chapter review. We're required to select a sample of public chapters to analyze the impact, looking at what they are actually costing in practice, and then present a follow-up to the Fiscal Review Committee to first hold ourselves accountable and hold departments accountable. And we do that each year, and if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to let me know about that. So my cursor has frozen, and I think that's the end of my presentation. I look forward to any questions, and if anyone has questions about any of this matters, please feel free to get in touch with us. Thank you all.
Thank you, Lucian. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. Now that we've heard from Ellen and Lucian, we're happy to take questions from the audience. Again, to ask a question, please type your question in the Q&A box on the right-hand corner of your screen. As we're waiting for questions, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the NCSL website. And it looks like our first question is directed to Alan. Alan, if a fiscal note is independent of the budget, how do you reconcile those two?
That's a great question. Is the question whether or not there's money in the budget to pay for it or not? Essentially, the problem would be there is no reconciliation. So in other words, we actually just had the situation of the session ends. Typically what happens is the budget passes before the end of the session. Unfortunately, sometimes it passes right at the last day, but sometimes it'll usually pass close to the end of session, and then bills will still be taken up. And usually those bills will, the question will come up as to whether there is funding in the budget. But that does not prohibit the bill from passing. If it does pass, the hope is that there would be enough of a balance to cover the funding that's needed. So there's two issues. One is whether or not the bill creates an imbalance in the constitutional requirement that we have a balanced budget. And in this case, in Connecticut, this year we have a $400,000 balance, which is tiny. And so we did not have any of those bills that affected the balance. But you could easily affect the balance, and I think in that case, that bill would be, I don't think we've ever had that situation where it's gone below the balance and would cause some kind of constitutional problem. So really the main problem would be whether or not how that bill is going to get funded. And if the bill became law without funding, the executive would have to try to find a way to fund it through other means during the year. And it does not take away the requirement on the agency to produce the program that has been required through the bill. And if it was bad enough that something needed to happen through funding, they'd have to call a special session, or the governor would veto the bill.
Thank you, Alan. Lucian, do you want to start with this next question? Do you ever have trouble obtaining the data you need from the executive branch? And if so, what are the options that you have to receive all the relevant information?
Yes, we have difficulty obtaining data. It's a constant difficulty getting as much information as you need in the time you have to do the work. One of the things one of the steps we've taken in the last year, the committee calendars are published on Wednesday for the next week, and we often had a lot of bills that we were trying to work on up until the next Tuesday on committee day, and we're waiting all weekend to get information. So along with our chairman, we put the departments on notice that we expected all support forms for bills that were calendared next week no later than close of business by Friday, which gave us about, I'd say, 85 to 90% reliability on getting a lot more data so that we had it over the weekend to work on. It's a tough part of the job getting the information that we can. But in addition to the information from departments, we get information wherever we can. So we'll use Google a lot. We'll use different databases, but we try to get the information to the best that we can. So.
Thank you, Lucian. Alan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think Lucian summed it up pretty well. The executive is, we are definitely we can be at odds in many cases, and one issue is just trying to get information within a timely fashion when the executive doesn't have a vested interest in keeping it from you, and there's just more of a bureaucratic issue of people doing their jobs and trying to get information to you in a timely manner. And then there's the other issue of the executive not wanting more information to be out there about this topic, and that's probably the bigger issue. And there's a balance between trying to work cooperatively with the executive and trying to be not back down from requiring the information to be sent. And if there's not a little tension between the executive and a nonpartisan office, we're probably not doing our job well enough.
Thanks. This next question is also for both of you. So, Lucien, if you'd like to begin again, can you talk a little bit about the difficulty of issuing dynamic fiscal notes?
Well, I wouldn't say that we do that often. In some cases, we'll issue dynamic notes that take into account, say it's a tax bill that reduces tax. We often will include an assumption that, say 50% of the money that's not taxed will then get spent in the local economy and generate additional new tax dollars. But for the most part, we issue just static fiscal notes because it is difficult. When you start getting into the dynamic methodology, you have a lot more variables and a lot more opportunities to make a mistake. And thankfully, our legislature is accepting of the static notes at this time. When we got into the commerce impact statements, we were concerned that we were being requested to do a lot more dynamic analysis, and thankfully, we've reined that in and try to just use the static method.
Thank you. Alan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so basically, this is a huge topic, and it's so many different angles to talk about this. I think that I agree with Lucien. I think there are so many different issues to deal with when you're doing a dynamic note that there's enough scrutiny with the fiscal notes as it is, and that's with direct impact. And once you start putting in the assumption after assumption after assumption, the room for error grows and grows and grows. So I think it's a major problem. I don't see how they are. I understand the need for them and I understand the desire for them, but I don't think that they are going to help the dialogue. And I think the parties that want them, for whether they're prevention or taxes, think that somehow the pronunciation from the nonpartisan fiscal office will solve all their problems. But even if we put it out there, it still has to pass. And and the other problem is that there's no consensus. There is not a lot of consensus on a lot of these questions, a lot of these economic questions. And I don't know how you move forward when there's not consensus on if tax cut A results in something else. If there's not consensus, I don't know how we actually answer that question and how that helps anyone. So there are a lot of issues, and I think some states do the dynamic fiscal notes, so they probably have more insight into it than we do, but we have not been pressured to do them.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you both very much for your time and your presentations, and this brings us to the conclusion of this webinar.
Thank you for having us.
It looks like my screen is also frozen here, but if you have any questions following this webinar, please feel free to email me at Erica, ERICA, .Michael, MICHEL, @ncsl.org, and we'll be happy to get back to you. Thank you for participating in today's webinar.